Do you know the origins of the names of the 50 states in the USA? While some are well known and easily understood, others remain debated. In this video, I'll be hitting all 50 state names. Keep watching if you want to find out which state was almost called Franklin, and how the French language snuck into some unexpected place names, and much more. We've got 50 states to cover, so let's get into it. Alabama is one of the more than 20 states who take their names in some form from indigenous words. It likely took its name most directly from the Alabama River, but how the river got its name is somewhat contested. Alabama may have first referred to a specific tribe in the Creek Confederacy, or Choctaw or Creek word meaning either vegetation gatherers or tribal town. Alaska comes from the Aleutian word Alakshak. That word itself has been alternately said to mean something like great country, that which the sea breaks against, or peninsula. Many names that come from indigenous American languages leave room for interpretation due to incomplete documentation and the difficulty of translation. Arizona is particularly steeped in confusion. It may be related to an Aztec term, Arizum, that alluded to the presence of silver in the area. Alternatively, some sources believe it's related to the word Arizonac from the Papagos tribe, which meant something like little springs and was likely a reference to how dry the region is. Arkansas is sometimes said to be the French pronunciation for the Kansas people, which we'll get to later, but that explanation is unverified. Other sources tie it to an Algonquin word, or various other indigenous languages. California was the name of a fictional island in a Spanish book from 1500. Hernan Cortés is generally credited with applying the name to the real-world place, probably in the 1530s. Colorado also comes from the Spanish. The name is linked with the Colorado River, which in turn likely describes the color of the river in certain places, a shade of red. Connecticut is also related to a river, one of more than 10 states whose names are related to water in some fashion. The indigenous word in question here may have referred to a long river, or the more descriptive, river whose water is driven in waves by tide winds. Thomas Westland wouldn't have made a great state name, so maybe we should be happy that they went with Delaware. Lord de la Warr, aka Thomas West, explored this area in the mid-Atlantic, eventually lending his title to the state's name. If Ponce de Leon had arrived in present-day Florida a week later, it probably would have a different name today. He landed in the region on the day of Spain's Feast of Flowers, or Pascua de Flores. The state was originally called Pascua Florida, before being shortened to its present name. Georgia is another example of a state being named for, or even by a person with a seemingly ample ego. King George II gave this state its name before it was a state, back in 1732. Hawaii is an anglicized version of a local name for the same place. That name, in turn, probably traces back to Hawaii Laua, a figure in the region's oral tradition who was said to have discovered one of the archipelago's major islands. American businessman George M. Willing supposedly claimed that the word Idaho meant gem of the mountains in Shoshone. That explanation may be apocryphal, but in any case, the name stuck. The word probably is related to an Indian word of some kind, but no definitive explanation exists. Illinois is a mashup of Illini, Indian, with a little French flair. The wa ending effectively turns it into an adjective to describe the place of Illini. Indiana is pretty obviously related to American Indians. That may be because the land was purchased from them. Iowa is a less generic reference to indigenous people in the region, but this is another origin that is inconclusive. Some say it's a Dakota word for a local tribe. Kansas comes from a Sioux word, which was applied to a tribe and river in the same area. The word has been translated as something like people of the south wind or wind people. And Kentucky is another state where basically all we know for certain is that the name came from an indigenous word. It's been tied to a Wyandot word for land of tomorrow, and a Shawnee word meaning head of the river, amongst other possible explanations. Louisiana's name is much easier to trace. French explorers named it in honor of King Louis XIV. Is Maine the mainland? It may be historically. One story says that the name came from a local term fishermen used speaking about the area as mainland. Maryland, meanwhile, was named after Charles I's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria of France. Massachusetts came from an Algonquin word, related to the hills around present-day Boston. Michigan also likely comes from Algonquin, meaning something like Great Lake. Incidentally, the state is still known as the Great Lakes State today. We're going to stay on the water theme for most of the M's. Minnesota comes from a Sioux word describing the river of the same name. Mississippi alluded to the great size of the Mississippi River, probably taken from Algonquin. And Missouri may have referred to muddy water. If so, that meaning survives the river's present-day nickname, Big Muddy. It's also been suggested that Missouris was a Sioux word used to refer to a town of large canoes. Either way, the state took its name from the river. Montana may have come from Spanish or from Latin, but its meaning is pretty clear: mountainous. And Nebraska takes us back to river-based origins. The Nebraska River may have been coined based on a word meaning flat water or flat river. That's ping pong back to Spanish. Nevada, meaning something like snow-capped, might seem confusing in the middle of a Las Vegas summer. If you look towards the state's mountains though, you'll understand the inspiration. New Hampshire is named after Hampshire, a county in southeast England. New Jersey follows a similar logic. Jersey is found off the coast of England. It's the largest of the Channel Islands. New Mexico takes its name from Mexico, obviously, which in itself is probably Nahuatl in origin. And New York, New Amsterdam, or New Netherland took on its current name after the English took control of the area from the Dutch. It was named in the honor of the Duke of York, who would eventually become King James II. James's father, Charles I, lent his name to the Carolinas. With some extra Latin flair, Carolus is the Latin equivalent of Charles. And the Dakotas, north and south, also share an etymology. In this case, it was the Dakota tribe, a subset of the Sioux. The word Dakota has been alternately translated as friend or allies. Ohio brings us back to a river. The Ohio River took its name from an Iroquois word for something like great or beautiful river. Oklahoma comes from two Choctaw words, which have been translated as red people. Oregon is another one of those states whose name is difficult to pin down. One version of its origin says it comes from an indigenous word for the local river, but it leaves out how the river itself got its name. Another says it comes from oreganum, an herb that grew in the region. And still another story is that the Spanish called local tribes oregones, meaning something like big-eared men. Maybe it's appropriate that it's hard to say Oregon's origin, because that already feels like the start of a tongue twister. Pennsylvania owes its name to its founder, William Penn. So where did Sylvania come from? That was Penn's idea, the Latin word for forest or woods. We know that Rhode Island came from the Dutch Rhode Island, but where the Dutch got the name is a matter of some debate. It may have been an homage to the island of Rhodes in present-day Greece, but more historians seem to think it was a reference to the red or rude clay found along the shores of the area. Tennessee is the state I alluded to at the beginning of the video. It was nearly called Franklin in honor of Benjamin. Franklin had a legislature and governor, but never made its way into statehood, eventually entered the country as Tennessee, taken from a Cherokee word. Texas, on the other hand, likely came from Caddo Indians, which used a word like Texas, meaning friends. The Spanish adapted that into something like Tellas or Tejas, and years later became Texas, a part of the United States. Utah is named after the region's Ute tribe. That word itself can't be definitively translated, though one explanation suggests that it meant something like people of the mountains. Vermont takes us back to French. Though Green Mountains might be translated as Montagne Verte today, Vermont was a variation on that idea that described the state's natural beauty. Virginia could just as well have been called Elizabethia. Why? Sir Walter Raleigh named it in honor of Queen Elizabeth, the so-called Virgin Queen. Washington, on the other hand, has the distinction of being the only state in the country named after an American historical figure. First President, George Washington. West Virginia has a pretty obvious explanation, related to Virginia. But like Tennessee, it could have had a different name. Kanawha was originally proposed as its name when seeking statehood. That name came from an Indian word used for an important river in the region. Like Illinois, Wisconsin may represent a mixture of Indian and French influences. The name originally comes from an indigenous word, and was for a period of time spelled Wisconsin by French settlers. Fittingly, we'll end on a state whose name could mean one of two things. Wyoming could be a reference to the mountains and valleys of the area taken from a local indigenous language. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, it may have referred to extensive plains. Since the state has both plains and mountains, it's hard to say which meaning is correct. For such a relatively young country, it's surprising how inexact many of these stories are. Have you heard of a different etymology for the state you live in? If so, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about language. Thanks for watching.